Hello and welcome to the Biomystical Womb Intro webinar focused on rebirthing. I'm going to share my screen here so that we can look at an outline I've made for this topic. Okay, so I'm Sama Morningstar, founder of the Womb-Centered Healing Temple, and the Biomystical Womb body of work is my unique healing modality that I'm creating, and actually I'm birthing this. It's coming through me. It's not a solo creation. It's a creation of the universe birthing through me. And it just so happens that I have the combination of healing practices in my background that have culminated in this this body of work coming through me. So it's coming through in several forms. The main form is this Biomystical Womb Apprenticeship that you can see here the logo for, and you can learn more about it on the website too, which I'll share more about at the end. So rebirthing is one of the phases in the Biomystical Womb Apprenticeship. And so there are, I think, 8 phases in the apprenticeship. Welcome. I see a new person coming in. I'm going to go ahead and mute you while we go through this, but you're welcome to unmute yourself if you have any questions. So there's 8 phases in the Biomystical Womb Apprenticeship. The first one is ancestral healing, and we talked about that in the first webinar series. I'll be sharing the recordings of all of them through the Eventbrite email platform, so you'll be able to see those as well. So why is rebirthing so important? Okay. So one of the big questions I ask people to impart the importance of these practices is, how are you conceived? Do you know if your mother had an orgasm or not during the sex act that conceived you? What were your parents' relationship like? What kind of sexuality was happening when you were conceived? And this is one of the things that everyone knows, that sex is part of conception. But there's so much suppression about our sexuality and about even imagining our parents having sex, that it's this big unasked question, and yet it's an essential blueprint for our life. So when we're conceived, we are designed for both parents to have this big explosion of pleasure in the form of orgasm. That creates a chemical cocktail of pleasure that supports the most vibrant conception between the sperm and the egg. And then when the sperm and the egg come together, there's another big orgasmic burst of the same kinds of pleasure chemicals in that sperm and the egg. Now, if the mother is not having an orgasm, which has become all too common, anorgasmic women, when they were conceived, then that's already half of that explosion of pleasure chemicals that isn't there. And it's actually kind of more than that, because the conception is happening inside the mother's body. So yes, the father had to have an ejaculation, which usually is accompanied by a pleasure in his body. But the sperm doesn't get to experience that for very long. It's out of there right quick, and then it's in the mother's body. And if the mother's body is not having this explosion of pleasure, if there's a big difference between the pleasure of the father and then coming into the mother's body, and there's not that pleasure happening there, that's a shock to that sperm. Oh, life is not about pleasure. Huh. And the DNA in that sperm get shut down. The life is about pleasure DNA gets shut down. the bliss creating DNA codes get shut down, and the stress, or gosh, if life isn't about pleasure, the uncertainty, is it safe to be here, all of that gets turned on in the DNA of the sperm. And then when it hits the egg, and the egg is already experiencing that as well, because the mother isn't having her most pleasurable time. And if the mother is under stress, and there are many aspects of modern male-female relationships, especially in an anorgasmic sexual relationship between a man and a woman, there are many dynamics that place a lot of the stress of life in the mother's body, in the woman's body. And so, being in a relationship like that where you're not having an orgasm as a woman, it's stressful. It's intrinsically stressful, whether it's because you're not having an orgasm or the reasons why you're not having an orgasm that are causing that stress. And it probably goes back many generations. And so that egg is already in a stressful state, and here meeting this sperm that is, been bathing on its journey to get to the egg in the stressful state of the mother, that sets a blueprint of that conception, that moment of conception, that life is about stress, it's not about pleasure, let's just get the job done. Okay? And that's how the DNA is programmed then. And then throughout that gestation, the next question is, how supported was your mother during her pregnancy with you? Was she stressed? Did she receive adequate care? And most of us were born in a society that does not fully support birthing mothers. And when I say fully support, I mean she has no concerns about her material health and well-being, the material support, food, shelter, safety. She has no concerns about that. She feels completely protected and cared for. She feels completely honored and respected and celebrated for this amazing miracle of creating a new life within her. All of her needs are met. Anything that she desires is provided to her easily without argument, and she can just be her miraculous self. Most of our mothers did not have that experience. And oftentimes it's actually really quite opposite to that. My mother, for example, was a single mom. She was a teenage mom at a time when there was huge shame around that. She didn't receive any support from my biological father whatsoever. He made it very clear that it would be her problem if she got pregnant as a result of their sexual activities. And she actually was hiding from the knowledge of her parents, knowing that she was pregnant with me, because she knew that her mother would take her to get an abortion if she knew about it. And this was back when they were illegal, and she would have been in Mexico getting an illegal abortion. So she hid me. So my whole program was, it's not safe for me to be here. My life is in danger, and I have to hide in order to remain safe. So that whole attitude my mother had about her pregnancy became my program. And that's why rebirthing and healing around that has become so important to me. It continues to be important to me because I've got to rewrite that program. That's no kind of program to live with, right? That's no kind of blueprint to build a life on. Okay? And so we all have some kind of blueprint like that, because it's been many, 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 many hundreds of thousands of years since women have been across the board fully supported like that. Most of our societies, because we live in a patriarchy that models the relationship of mothers and fathers in a domination model where the father is dominant over the woman, being dominated by your partner is not supportive for that kind of well-being that I'm talking about when I say, was she fully supported? So there's an intrinsic stress and trauma of being in domination-based relationships. And even if our mother managed to have a true partnership that was based on partnership instead of domination with our father, the rest of the society wasn't offering that to her. And so, he's under stress trying to make sure she has her needs met when the rest of society isn't really geared towards that or organized around that. So then that continues forward to how was she born? Well, and also part of the previous question, did she receive adequate care? What kind of support did she receive? You know, it's been many, many generations now where the wise women, the midwives and the herbalists that have carried the traditions of caring for women in pregnancy and childbirth that have been completely annihilated, those traditions, especially in European lineages and here in the United States. They've been annihilated and continue to be terribly oppressed and repressed. And so, and that the modern medical systems are based on a mechanical model of medicine that sees the body as a machine with parts that need to be replaced and controlled, that has no recognition or validation of our body's intrinsic ability to heal itself and regenerate and generate new life. And so the approach to childbirth, although there's been many, there's lots of really helpful things that modern medicine does for pregnant women and can save, you know, women and babies' lives when they're in danger. As far as just regular birthing, a lot of modern medicine practices can be very disruptive and traumatizing, and unnecessarily so, especially here in the United States, where the infant mortality and maternal mortality rates, especially for people of color, people of African and indigenous descent, are genocidal, basically. And even for people of European descent, you know, here in the United States, it's pretty atrocious. So, and that's been going on for generations. Okay, so how were we born? Was birth traumatic for your mother or for you as a baby? Was your father there? Who was there? How were they supporting your mother? So all of these relationships gave us a blueprint as tender infants that were absorbing everything. We absorbed while our mother was pregnant with us, everything that she experienced. And that's what created our understanding of life and the blueprint for our body, our spirit, our emotions. And then the process of being born is such a huge transition. And if it was traumatizing or interfered with in any way, if it wasn't honored or cared for, and by being honored and cared for, what I mean by that is that it's been shown with evidence-based research that, you know, and we don't even need that to just know in our bones that the birth process is a natural, organic process that doesn't, most of the time, doesn't need any interference, and in fact, interference with it can be the cause of trouble. And so the tendency, though, with modern medicine is to interfere with it more and more frequently out of a sense of needing to control it, make it more convenient, dishonoring the mystery of birth that comes when it comes at the right time, that the body knows intrinsically. Whereas nowadays, doctors, and even for many generations, doctors have been trying to determine and say it should happen now, and if it doesn't happen now, it's a bad thing. So we could go on and on about how the various ways that modern medicine is treating childbirth is traumatizing to mothers and babies in subtle, micro ways, like, you know, like little ways, small ways that add up over time, but also in very big ways that happen all at once, especially in the birth process. So if the mother was unsupported, then she's stressed, then she's got tension, then she's more likely to need interventions or to appear to need interventions or have difficulty during childbirth that then require interventions. And then it all adds up to very frequent traumatization during birth. And then, you know, how we are treated as infants right after birth. right? This tradition of hanging the baby by its feet and spanking its behind to get it to start breathing. That's a slip of the tongue, but it's kind of apropos, because what a traumatizing way to be welcomed into the world. And that's been a traditional practice for many generations. So this all gives our DNA the message that it's not safe to be here, and gives us the blueprint that we need to escape. We need to figure it out mentally. We need to dissociate from our body. These are all traumatized responses, trauma looping responses to these. For an infant, these, traumas that most adults are like, oh, that's just the way things are. For an infant, it's terribly traumatizing. And that's why babies cry. So, when you listen sometimes to babies crying, the anguish in babies' cry sometimes is so heartbreaking, because here they were, maybe feeling safe and cozy in the womb, but it might have already started that they didn't feel safe and cozy in the womb. And then it just got worse and worse and worse. They went from being at one with everything as a spirit to feeling all of these stressful, isolative, traumatizing experiences. And it's like, what did I sign up for? Sometimes I hear babies crying that's very filled with anguish. It's like, I take it back. I don't really want to be here. I can't do this, right? That there's just this like calling out to the powers that be, get me out of here. This isn't right. Something's not right here. So this is all optional. Yet this is how we've set things up in our society. This is how we've evolved. This is an experiment that we're going through as a species. And I feel it's important for us to evolve out of this if we're going to survive. Okay? So this is why rebirthing is so important, because here we are with our DNA and our bodies being programmed with all of these stressful systems, ways of responding to the world, the way the world has influenced us. And then we just keep perpetuating it over and over again. And when we have children, then, we do the same thing. How many people grow up and complaining that their parents didn't do it right, and then when they have children, find themselves doing the same thing their parents did? And that's because it's programmed into our DNA, and we can think about it that maybe we could, it could be different. But then we despair because time and again we find ourselves behaving in the same re-traumatizing patterns. And so the trick to really changing that has to be a very body-centered transformation. So how can we reprogram our DNA to create a new body and a new approach to life? So there have been many different traditional approaches to rebirthing. One that people might be familiar with is in Christianity. Being reborn as a Christian often involves baptism and submersion in water, which is a body thing. It's a somatic experience. And the original practice that I learned about studying esoteric Christianity was that the baptizer, the priest or the whoever was doing the baptism, would hold the person underwater until they started to drown and actually felt like they had died. And then they would bring them back up and revive them. And now this life was a new life for them. They were reborn in this, in this approach. So baptism originally was that kind of rebirth. Okay, it's not nowadays. When I was baptized, there was no holding under the water until it was just a quick submersion. But that was the origins of that practice, to have such a reset of the program that, okay, you died to your old self and you are reborn to a new self. And it's a symbolic thing, but then that begins the process of, okay, how is this new self living? And as we know from witnessing what goes on in modern religion and churches. There may be a belief that a big change has occurred, but there's all kinds of perpetuated harmful, traumatizing behavior that still goes on in those communities. I speak from my own personal experience, and that's what drew me to seek out more effective methods of transformation. So another one that people might be familiar with is breath work that focuses on rebirthing. And there are some lineages that focus on doing very intense, almost hyperventilating type of breath work that has a similar, well, not so much similar to the way baptism is doing it now, but I imagine more similar to how baptism was when you got held under the water for longer and controlling the breath in that way. And breath work is well known to make powerful transformations in the nervous system and like that. And focusing on, so there's various traditions of breath work that uses very intense and rigorous breathing practices to make those shifts in the nervous system and to sort of reprogram the system. Unfortunately, many of them actually are re-traumatizing in them themselves and haven't been very trauma informed for the past number of years as those have been developed. It's only more recently that we've begun to understand how trauma perpetuates itself. And so there are a lot of people over the past decades past few decades that were exploring these kinds of intensive breath work, rebirthing types of practices. And, some of them involved wrapping people up in sort of blankets and really tightly and putting a lot of body weight on top of them. So they felt the constriction of being inside the womb and almost to the point of not being able to breathe, to sort of reproduce the experience of the infant as it's coming through the birth canal, of not being able to, and people are being re-traumatized physically now. So now they're having another experience now that it's not safe to be here. That's embedded in their system with this powerful breath practice that's meant to reprogram the nervous system, but it's just reprogramming it with another traumatizing experience. So another approach to, and that's not to say that all breath work is like that focuses on rebirthing. There are lots of rebirthing breath work practices that are very gentle and that are more trauma informed. So I don't want to invalidate all of those. It's just some of them have had a reputation of having that effect. So I'm very careful about that as far as what kind of breath work I engage with. I tend to, and I'll talk about this more as we get to my approach, is I tend to have very gentle practices that don't get you super high, or don't get, because when you chase after getting really high with really intensive practices, you inevitably have the low at the other end of that. And you end up on a roller coaster ride of practice where you get really, really high and then you drop off, and it becomes addictive because you're always trying to chase after that high. And so what I try to cultivate in my programs is a sustained, gradual transformation. So we're replacing all the stress hormones with pleasure on a day-to-day basis, pleasure hormones and well-being hormones and all of that, and finding homeostasis. So we're getting off that roller coaster ride. Okay, so another type of practice that is often used for rebirthing is visionary work. So guided meditations, visualizations, things like that. And I use this a lot in my work. The power of our imagination is very important. And, this kind of work shows up in any kind of ritual practice. It's used in almost all spiritual lineages. Anytime there's storytelling, mythology telling, that's taking us on a guided visualization. But we get to look at that and see, what program do we want to establish for ourselves? Are these mythologies that we're being told in this lineage or that lineage, what's the message that they're giving me? And you know, since we're not like still living in a time where you have your lineage, your tradition that's passed down from you, and that's what you stick with for the rest of your life. That's not how our lives are now. So many of us have been disconnected from our traditional lineages and spiritual traditions that it's important to get back in touch with them, but then also look at what the mythologies are really telling us, and how we're reprogramming ourselves with those mythologies. And a lot of the mythologies that we might have in a tradition that we try to reclaim, say, you know, the goddess traditions, you know, looking at the Greek gods and goddesses, for example, a lot of the mythologies around the goddesses are very patriarchal. The goddesses in these stories are constantly being raped and violated, and you know, there's just a lot of violence in a lot of these stories. And we get to reach farther back. In the work that I do, I like to reach farther back to pre-patriarchal mythologies, and we have to use our imagination for that because we don't have any record of that. And so we can reach farther back and find mythologies and stories that can guide us and access that through the ancestral healing that I talked about in the previous webinars as well. So visionary work with the guided meditations, and then we get to create with our imagination. We can imagine the kind of life we do want to live. So even me telling you that life could be about pleasure and bliss, that's a visionary invitation right there that gives our DNA the possibility that maybe it could turn on we could access and turn on that capacity within us to have a life that was about pleasure and bliss. And so we get to activate our own imagination and follow those lines of visionary work that take us to another way of life and rebirth ourselves in that way. So I do a lot of rebirthing ceremonies, visionary rebirthing ceremonies, where we imagine that we're revisiting ourselves in our mother's womb, and that we're bringing allies, and that we're becoming our own guardian angel, and that we're bringing that pleasure, a different way of being to ourselves. And it becomes quite real when we're in these visionary journeys, and that kind of journeying can reprogram our DNA, and we can start to have a different experience. So these are all ways that we can get free of the biological trauma cycle, and there's more ways that can support these ways too. Okay, so using our imagination, using our breath, and I just want to go back to these previous ones, because the baptism and the breath work, we can reframe those. You know, for me, a baptism was like you got in the water with the pastor one time, and then that was it. I've since can come to a place where there's sacred waters, and studied to be an aquatic bodywork practitioner. And I bring people into the water, in warm water, and hold them and give them an experience of like they're back in the womb again, physically now. And it's a very gentle experience. I listen and feel their breath, and they go under the water and come up from the water and breathe. And I'm listening to their breath and in sync with them in a way that their mother might never have been. And that by itself, of having somebody holding you in this amniotic water and really attending to you from a place of being well tended themselves, is so transformative. And so I've taken baptism, and many other aquatic bodywork practitioners have taken baptism and rebirthing through the waters into a whole nother place. And then breath work as well. Yoga, there's lots of modalities that work with the breath to reprogram our whole body and our whole nervous system into a new way of being. So we can and what I've been doing is synthesizing the different breath work practices that I've learned, and bringing together the ones that felt the most effective for me with this self-transformative process that could awaken my own the rebirth experience that I want to have, that feels sustained and nourished to me. So all of these can contribute to this getting free of the biological trauma cycle. Other ways that we can do that, because the biological trauma cycle is about these hormones that are flowing through us, and they're addictive. The stress hormones can be quite addictive, and they can be quite damaging to our systems. And the more they damage us, the more stressed we are, and it's just this endless cycle. And so we need to get free of that endless cycle, and there's ways that we can do that. Herbal healing, so using herbs to nourish our bodies to come back into balance, to get out of that stress cycle. There's loads of herbs that are very helpful for that. The plants want us to be healthy and well. It's better for everything, every living being on this planet, for humans to be healthy and well. So the plants are doing their darndest to give us the medicine that we need so that we can be healthy and well. Okay? Somatic healing. So somatic means oriented to the body. Okay, so there's a lot of healing therapies nowadays that are talking about somatic healing. Psychologists, counselors are now being trained. When I studied psychology back in college 25 years ago, there was no somatic psychologist. There was no somatic class at UC Davis where I went to school. There was no orientation towards the body. But nowadays, you can get a somatic therapy degree, at least not in the United States. Maybe there were in other countries back then. But it's been gradually over the years, people are recognizing that talking and thinking about what's going on for us doesn't really get us out of those trauma loops. It actually can re-fortify them. Okay, so every time we tell the story about what happened to us back then, it can fortify those trauma loops and doesn't really help us get out of it. Now, there are some talk therapy techniques that can help perhaps change your behavior or reorganize things, but ultimately you're still in that stress loop, that trauma chemical soup that's flowing through you, because that's what you got programmed with. And the way to change that has to be in the body, not in our thinking, not in our mind. So yoga is a somatic healing practice. Some talk therapies combine somatic awareness. So you're telling the story and they say, okay, now breathe and tell me what you feel in your body. Where is this story residing in your body? What does it feel like? What color is it? What flavor does it have? What does it smell like? What texture does it have? What temperature? So it gets you in touch with your senses and how your body feels, which so many of us have dissociated from. We have lost our ability to even feel what's going on in our body, but that's where our real true wisdom resides. And so embodying practices that help us to feel our bodies and let the body's natural trauma unwinding process occur. So, for example, a lot of yoga, yes, it can provide somatic healing, but it can often be quite rigid. You have to move in a certain way. You're trying to make the body do these practices in this very specific, certain way. And it has to be in this alignment. That doesn't allow for the kind of somatic unwinding that often needs to occur for things like birth trauma, where if the baby was squeezed into a position because the mother wasn't allowed to move freely, and she didn't even feel her body, and things got twisted for the baby, and the baby's born with their hand and arm like this, and their shoulder gets jammed and their neck gets jammed. Right? Just like if they had an accident, they fell on their bicycle as a kid or got in a car accident as adults, something like that would happen. There's a natural way that the body will unwind from an experience like that if it's allowed to. but oftentimes babies are wrapped up right away and not allowed to wiggle around, and no attention is paid to their somatic healing process. And so that pattern in the body is retained, that trauma pattern, and the stress of it's retained in that tissue. And I've traced many of my bodywork clients' chronic injuries or ailments where they have scar tissue, where they've injured themselves numerous times throughout their life. We look back and say, well, what happened when you were born? And lo and behold, they find out that they had a very similar body stress that happened when they were born. And they've just been repeating that pattern every time they fall, or every time they crash their bike, or every time they get in an accident, they contract around that already contracted spot and re-injure the same place. And so that allowing for unwinding is much more supported in more dance-like movements, and then more so than the rigid yoga movements that say you have to move in this particular way. Okay, so I could add here dance therapy. Okay, and then dance therapy also brings in the emotional expression part of it as well, because our emotions get lodged in the body when we don't learn how to have healthy emotional expression and healthy emotional processing, which is very much a somatic thing. And we're often, in most of our upbringing, we're taught that it's not okay to process and feel our emotions, that our emotions are a nuisance, are an inconvenience. They get in the way of what's valued most, which is logical thinking. And that logical thinking is where you need to put your attention and just sweep your emotions under the rug, which means, translated for me, as stuffing it in my body, and which ends up in physical ailments. And the womb is a great place that people end up stuffing their unprocessed, unresolved emotions, because of what we were talking about before we start the recording today, which is that, that's right where the chakras, the chakra system is the energy system of the body, and that's where our emotional center is right around the womb space. So when we have unresolved emotions, they all get built up right there, and the womb is a great organ for holding something in that keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're not encouraged to activate the natural releasing powers of the womb, the letting go powers of the womb, the menstrual cycle and menstruation itself is terribly suppressed and shamed. And so, we emphasize the importance of holding things in. And then the letting go, don't let anybody see that. So that shows up in how we look at our menstrual cycle as well. So sound healing is another way. I kind of skipped ahead to the womb there. I'll say more about that. But sound healing is another way of freeing ourselves from the biological trauma cycle. So what happens when we do sounding practices like chanting, toning, or even just sighing with a ha, with a vocalization, or even, sometimes hearing our own voice, unless we're telling re-traumatizing stories, and perpetuating that. If we do a healing vocal practice where our focus is on self-healing and beauty and pleasure, what happens with the sound of our voice vibrating through our body is that it actually stimulates the release of those pleasure hormones, one in particular, nitric oxide, from our bones, tissues, and blood vessels. And this is a short-lived pleasure gas that's the same one that's produced when we have an orgasm, and the sperm and the egg meet, and even near-death experiences. And it actually neutralizes the stress hormones in our tissues, and in our blood, and in our organs. And so making healing vocal sounds, our own healing vocal sounds, I feel is the most potent. We can listen to sound healing, and that has somewhat the same effect, but when we make our own healing sounds, that's resonating much more deeply in the body than listening to someone else's sound healing music. Now, if you know, have a sound therapist that has the crystal bowl on top of you and ringing the crystal bowls right there on your body, you might really feel that sound resonating in you. And I highly encourage anyone who has access to that kind of sound healing to avail yourself of that. And we all have our own voices right here, right now, anytime, to engage with our own sound healing powers. So I've just been going on, and I just want to pause for a second in case anyone has any burning questions you've been holding on to before I talk about how we can activate the womb and how the role the womb plays in all of this.
Hi, can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
Hi. Yeah, everything that you've said has captivated me. It really has. It's mesmerised me because I know when I was born, my mum suffered. She experienced preeclampsia, so she did experience it, and she didn't bond with me for 2 days. Although I had an absolutely fantastic childhood, I really have. I always felt that there was a part of me that didn't belong. And even now in adult life, I'm 54, and there's still a part of me that I've worked on now for, like, you know, probably be about 20 years, to belong and to honour myself and to love myself and to not feel separate from my body. So I'm really trying now to honour who I am and own my own authenticity and do my own sense of rebirthing myself. But it's been a long journey. It really has. So thank you so much for hosting this program, because it's touched my heart.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm glad that it's touched you, and that it resonates with your experience. You know, most of the time when I share about those, you know, conception, gestation, birth experiences, we're taught to minimize it. We're taught to minimize the importance of it, and that's why I like to really speak to the importance of it. And you can see in your own life how that pattern has been there at the foundation of your being all this time, and probably a pervading factor in all of your healing processes that you
definitely. Thank you.
Okay, so and Firebird is saying theater therapy also offers great access to the body and the womb. We've used it with survivors of sexual assault, and it truly helps to get into the body and recognize where we hold traumatic feelings. Excellent. Thank you for sharing about that, Firebird. I'll add that to my list, because that might combine a number. Theater therapy might combine a number of these different things. You might have somatic healing aspects to your theater therapy practices. You might have visionary work, if there's storytelling involved, mythologies or stories that you're enacting. There might be some dance movement therapy. There might be sound healing, you know, vocalization. And so I'd be very curious to learn more about specific theater therapy modalities. Perhaps not in this webinar per se, but hopefully it'll pique our curiosity to learn more about those modalities. Let's see here. Let's see another chat. Oh, Kampalia, that's right. Of course. We have different names. Thank you for clarifying with your new name, maybe not so new, Firebird Healing. Thank you. All right, so the womb. How is the womb involved with all of this? So of course we recognize that the womb is involved at the beginning, and often the womb is doing her best to generate new life, given all of these circumstances and situations that are that could diminish her power to do so. So the womb is miraculously being able to generate new life in spite of all of these adverse circumstances, and protect that new life as best as she can. But there's there's a filtration that happens with the womb as to what the child that's gestating inside receives from the mother and what the mother receives from the child. And there's a deliberate sharing of the hormones, including the stress hormones, so that that child can be prepared for what's in store with its life. So that's a deliberate caring for the child that the womb does. It says, okay, this is the stress that your mother is under. Be prepared. And develop yourself in a way that prepares you for the life that you're getting ready to embark upon. So, you know, one might think, well, why didn't the womb protect that child from those hormones? Well, if the child were protected from those hormones, but then got birthed into this world where all that stress was going on, that would be a major shock, and the child wouldn't be prepared. And so there's a caring that happens in the womb. And then as we grow older, and those of us who are womb bearers, who have actual physical uteri, yes, it's plural, but also even those who are not womb bearers, we still have the same material. So everything that creates our genitalia starts out as one thing in everyone. It's one organ in the body of the developing fetus, that then when that chromosome that says what gender you might be, which there's more than 2, by the way, there's about 11 different genders that people develop into, and most people who are, there's about 4% of the population that's born naturally hermaphroditic in all mammalian species. And the reason we don't see more of that in humans and even domesticated animals is because they're just surgically altered at birth, often without the parents' consent or knowledge. So if the baby is born with hermaphroditic genitalia, the doctors will just do the surgery without telling anyone, and make a choice for them and tell the parents you have a boy or a girl, so that that baby will fit into the binary gender norms of our society. And so there's another source of trauma for us to process, if that might have been what happened for us. But so whatever gender of the 11 genders that we develop into because of our chromosomes and because of the environmental factors, has the same material. It's all comes out of the same material of the original womb that we started with. So that's why I like to say that, you know, yes, some of us might be womb bearers and that we have a uterus that can create a new life, or do this part of creating a new life of gestating and birthing a baby. But others have the same organs, just in a different form, that have a different part to play in that creating new life, but they all carry that same energy of creativity and life generative powers. Okay, so all of our genitalia, internal, external, whatever shape or whatever that might be for us, it all has these same womb powers, and I call them womb powers because the uterus, which we associate as the womb, has such a very dramatic demonstration of these life-generating powers that we can refer to as a map. But it relates to everyone who might have different genitalia and might not have a uterus per se. So the womb, as a model of our life-generative powers, has so much to offer us that is suppressed and ignored. So the menstrual cycle, for example. The menstrual cycle reflects the cycles of nature, the seasons of the year, the rising and falling of the sun, the circulation of the moon, the phases of the moon, the tides of the ocean are all reflected in that menstrual cycle. This is how life regenerates itself. It has cycles of growth and building up and nourishment and the height of heightened fertility, followed by cycles of decomposition and letting go and release, which are then followed by cycles of growth and building up and nourishment. And it's this constant perpetual cycle. And it's very cyclical, it's very circular, and it goes round and round and round. And as we know, if we want to go from one place to another, the circular wheel is the best kind of tool to have to get us there more quickly. Square wheels don't get you anywhere. Straight lines, unless you've got a wheel rolling on top of a straight line, that straight line doesn't really get anywhere. It just is. So this cyclical nature of the womb is something that we can feel inside of ourselves if we connect with our bodies and honor and celebrate the cycles of our bodies, whether we have a menstruating uterus or not, to recognize the seasons of our bodies. And if we do have a menstruating uterus, to have that monthly process that we go through, and to fortify it and to nourish it and to heal it if there's any, which often we do have, imbalances because it's been so suppressed for so many generations. And letting that become a map for our creativity. Because, you know, our society that suppresses this kind of cyclical, seasonal nature understanding of things says, if you're going to create something, you have to go from point A to point B in a straight line and go directly there. And that's not how creativity works. And so many creative people, if we get indoctrinated with that logical thinking way of creativity, you have vision. This is how many artists are abandon their art. It's because you have a vision and you should be able to take step A to step B to step C and get to your vision exactly as you envisioned it. And life doesn't work that way. Creativity doesn't work that way. Creativity says, okay, you have that vision. Well, guess what? Your motivation to get to that vision is going to keep you moving forward, even though we're going to have curveball over here that takes you way over here and the other side of the world to discover an essential part of your vision that's going to take you, you know, somewhere close to your vision. But when you get there and you find and you get close to your vision, you realize the vision you got to is actually better than the one that you envisioned in the first place, because you had all these side roads and everything else that happened along the way, and that you had these cycles of building up and letting it go because that didn't work, and building up and letting it go because that didn't work, or building up and letting it go just because that's the cyclical nature of things, and you need to build it up and let it go lots of times. And even when you do get to your vision, you might have to let that go because you have a new vision now that you're going to build up. And so letting the womb guide us in our creative process is super important. And the womb can offer us guidance in our healing process as well. So that cyclical nature, that seasonal nature of building up and releasing and building up and releasing, if we can embrace that, bring that into harmony, so it's no longer a roller coaster ride of trying to get high and higher and higher and higher and higher and thinking it's going to be a linear thing and that we're never going to be low again. Instead, if we say, you know what, we're just going to be on this wave motion and let that be harmonious, and we're not trying to get any higher, and then we're not crashing so low, and we're just going to be with that and let that build gradually over time. So the biomystical womb approach to rebirthing is very much about activating the womb and utilizing and synthesizing all of these methods that I've talked about, and then some new ones too. Theater therapy, perhaps that's going to come in to play at some point. Hopefully, Kampalia will educate us more about that at some point. And so synthesizing all of these and allowing the rhythms of the womb to guide us and the messages of the womb. So noticing how the menstrual cycle is ailing, isn't in optimum health or harmony, and listening to that as a guideline for how we could be in optimum health and harmony and optimum creative potential, optimizing our creative potential and our creative flow. So herbal healing and all of these healing modalities to help to bring that menstrual cycle into greater harmony. And visionary work around all of the different initiations throughout our lives, the ancestral healing before we're born, the rebirthing, going back and visiting the birth process, and then throughout our whole life cycle, where a fully healthy and vibrant womb in our mother and in the other people in our lives, womb space, if that were there, that would have been activated for us. So we get to go back and revisit ourselves in those different ages with a fully vibrant womb space and activate that for ourselves retroactively. So another big aspect of the biomystical womb approach to rebirthing is activating our inner guidance and our womb powers, just as what I was saying. So our inner guidance means that it's not me all the time telling you what you need to do. It's not an authoritarian teacher model. It's a partnership model of healing. Okay, so helping the apprentices and other students to get in touch with that inner guidance. And one of the core practices of the biomystical womb apprenticeship is womb listening. So womb listening in the sense of listening to whatever symptoms we might have in the womb space, but also listening to the wisdom that's there, listening to our unique creative powers that are there and letting those guide us, listening to our intuition and letting that guide us, and reprioritizing that wisdom, that intuition, and freeing ourselves from this domination model that says logical thinking is more important or more valid than our emotional wisdom or our intuition, our intuitive wisdom, or our womb wisdom. So sort of evening the score there and saying, actually, our womb wisdom can really be a powerful guide and is a powerful guide that is much more all-inclusive than our logical thinking brain. Our logical thinking brain, it makes up 5% of our brain. So we're limiting ourselves to just 5% of our capacities when we prioritize that and validate that over all of our other powers of perception and wisdom. So another pause for any questions that anyone might have about any of this. Thumbs up, I see. Does that mean you have a question, Kampalia, or just giving a thumbs up?
I actually had a comment,
Okay,
if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
Perfect. I'm so grateful you talked about, artists finding their way and working on a project. You must be reading my mind because I'm literally working on a project right now, and it's taking me halfway across the globe. And everything that you've mentioned is so right. And just being able to be in the flow of it and let it go. It's not just a project that works through us. I think it's life, and you have to change with it. So thank you so much for talking and mentioning that.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your wisdom, your creative wisdom with us as well. Anyone else have any questions? I'm just gonna take us on a visit to the Biomystical Womb Apprenticeship sign-up page, so you can see this. If you went to my website, which is called wombcenteredhealing.com, you would land on this page. It's going to get us there in a moment. This is the Womb Centered Healing Temple page, and you could learn about different aspects of the Womb Centered Healing Temple, like that. And then you could go up here to the menu and go to the Biomystical Womb Apprenticeship page and learn more about that. So there's a little video, me talking about it, some of the things that I've shared here, a written description. The next cohort for this year starts October 31st. And the apprentices from last year will still be in the program too. And some of them might even continue through the next cohort as well as mentors and or participants. And so we'll be coming into a cozy nest if you might like to join us for that. It's an all genders apprenticeship, as I shared about earlier. I feel we all have a womb space. We were all born from a womb. We all have a relationship with our own womb space and others that are womb bearers, even if we do not have a uterus. And that those relationships with the womb and our experiences in and of the womb are central to our lives. So all genders are welcome in this apprenticeship to work with all of that. So I write some about that. You can read that if you visit the page. Then I'll share that, as I said, there are 8 phases in the apprenticeship. So there's the pre-birthing phase, that is the ancestral healing phase that I talked about a few weeks back in the first set of webinars. There's the rebirthing phase. And each of these phases lasts about a month, where we do a bunch of preparatory work, and we do of all these different types of healing modalities that we discussed in this webinar. And then we usually have a ceremony at the end, a rebirthing ceremony or an ancestral council ceremony, things like that. Next week, we'll be talking in the webinars about the remothering phase. We'll be talking about the importance of whether or not we were breastfed and how the relationship with our parents, our mothers were. We work through that, and we focus on that and bringing healing to those experiences. And then there's the coming of age phase. So we'll have webinars about that in a few weeks, where we look at coming of age as adults, the starting of menstruation for womb bearers, and the development of sexuality and adult selves, and how we can bring healing to where that process was suppressed or under recognized, unhonored, uncelebrated, which is so often the case, unfortunately. Then we'll move into a creative fertility phase, where we'll be talking about and working with all of these healing approaches, our creativity and our fertility and how that's related. And fertility in the sense of being able to generate new life, not necessarily a baby, but perhaps a creative project of some sort, but certainly creating a new human is included in that as well. That includes all different kinds of creative fertility, and seeing the fertility of our bodies as a model, as a map for our artistic creativity, our business creativity, our whatever kind of creativity we're working with. And then we move into creative partnerships, so really focusing in on our relationships and how we can bring the creativity, the creative fertility we've just been working with, into creating more partnership-oriented relationships and breaking free of and healing free of those domination-based relationships. Then right now we're in the enchantress phase of this year's apprenticeship. That'll be next year around this time, we'll be in it again. And the enchantress or enchanter phase is where we really start to explore our soul purpose and awakening to our inner power and guidance about how we will enchant the world towards our inner vision of beauty and well-being. So all that foundational healing that we did in all those prior phases comes to blossom in helping us to create what we're here to create, and start to become clear about that as we've freed ourselves from any hindrances that we may have. And then the wise one phase. So this enchanter phase is often associated with premenopause or like empty nest, like with children are raised and gone from the home, things like that. That phase of life. But we all have that phase as we go through the seasons of life. That's the autumn season after we've come down off of height of fertility of summertime, and things are starting to move towards the fall, and the veil between the worlds, magic is quite enhanced at that time of the year and that time of the menstrual cycle. And so that's the enchanter phase. Then we move into the wise one phase, where if we're womb bearers, we're holding our blood, not releasing it every month, and where we are really coming into and embodying that soul purpose, and it becomes very efficient and focused, and there's lots of preparation we can do for that, and coming into honoring those wisdom years that are ahead for all of us, hopefully. And maybe we're in already in a certain way, and so we'll work with that. And so each phase has various components: live opening and closing ceremonies, co-creative video circles, herbal medicine making instruction, pre-recorded practices, and then online connection and sharing circle, and bonus guest instruction events. And then apprentices that want to do the whole 13 months, who complete the whole 13 months and a list of qualifying activities, will graduate as biomystical womb mentor priestesses, or priests, I guess, or I don't know what the non-binary gendered term for priest or priestess might be. I'll have to come up with a new term. Mentor, we could just use mentor. So this is just a list here of some of the required things that will qualify someone to be a certified mentor at the end of the program. So there's kind of a teacher training, mentor training incorporated in the program, but that's kind of optional. You don't have to do it. If you want the certificate and be listed on the website as one of the certified mentors, then you can meet those requirements. And there's other opportunities for certified mentors as well. So that's the whole thing. It also includes some one-to-one sessions, and there'll be some updates about all of that coming in here soon. So you can always, there's a radical sliding scale depending on your yearly income, and there's also an application for monthly payments, work trade, or scholarship. So you can check out that. And then if you want to talk with me about the possibility of joining us in the Biomystical Womb Apprenticeship, you can book a womb listening initiation down here at the bottom. And I'll lead you in a guided meditation, a womb listening meditation, so that you can connect with your womb wisdom and receive guidance about your participation in this program and how it might look for you. So that's it. So any questions about any of that before we complete? All right, well, and I'm gonna stop our screen share here and come back. So there we have it. As I said, I'm available for any questions. And I'll be sharing the recordings through the email list that's generated by Eventbrite. So you'll get a copy of the recordings, and you'll get copies, I think, of all the other recordings as well, because I'll just send them out to everyone who has attended any of these webinars. So you can listen in about the other phases as well. So thank you so much for joining me now for joining me on this webinar, or for listening to the recording. And that's all for now. Hope to
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome, Camille.